Vă spun bun găsit la o nouă emisiune, viitorul medicina holistică, în Clinica Medicală Aura Vita, alături de doamna doctor Florinela Balan. Doamna doctor, creierul uman este foarte dezvoltat față de animale. De exemplu, cu toate că folosim doar 10% din capacitatea lui.
Asta știam până acum. O să vedeți că domnul doctor Bruce Lipton ne aduce argumente împotriva acestor considerente.
Hi, dear friends, cultural creatives, and imaginal selves everywhere. Bruce back. And this month's newsletter, I really want to focus on something called an urban myth. And this particular urban myth is the belief that we only operate off of 10% of our brain. So we've all heard that, yes, we're only using 10% of our brain. And boy, if we could use all the rest of it, we'd be super smart. But hey, that's all we use. Firstly, where did that number come from, 10%? A long time ago, when putting the body together through an understanding of histology and the cells that make up organs, a study of the brain revealed one very important fact, and that is only 10% of the brain was made up of neurons. 90% of the cells in the brain were not neurons, but they were called supporting or connective tissue and given the name glial cells. Well, what's really interesting about that is in the neuron principle, the neuron doctrine, it was believed that the neurons were the functional cells of the brain and the glial cells were more or less just support. Well, then by definition, right away, it says then you're only using 10% of your brain because that's all that the neurons comprise in the brain, 10%. For a long time, the glial cells, again, were thought to be just like connective tissue support physically and nutritionally the neurons. But over the last number of decades, what we started to find is this: there was a misunderstanding about glial cells. That glial cells are a lot more important in neural function than just physical support. Glial cells can inhibit or activate neurons. Glial cells connect to neurons. Glial cells can control the activity of neurons. So all of a sudden, these glial cells, which were looked at as just passive cells in the brain, turn out to be actually quite functional in integrating the nature of how the brain works. In a way of looking at it, in a simple analogy, consider that the neurons are nouns in a sentence, and that the glial cells are the verbs and the adjectives and the adverbs, the modifiers of all the nouns. So the glial cells create a fulfillment of a picture. So neurons are like a stick figure, and when you add the glial cells, you fill out the nature of the whole human. So glial cells become a very functional, integrated part of all neuronal activity. So the concept of the neuron doctrine that said only neurons are involved with functioning in the nervous system, it turns out the glial cells are as well. So now we're not dealing with 10% of the brain, we're dealing with 100% of the brain. Yes, you have access to 100% of your brain all of the time. But does that mean that we actually use the whole brain all of the time? And the answer is no. Because what we start to find out is when we start to live in patterns and in habits, that what happens is we just activate certain neuronal pathways that are habitual pathways. And as a result, these are the pathways that have preference in our everyday life. But if you can engage whole brain activity, you can enhance your consciousness and your awareness and your ability to control your life. So basically it says that we can become whole brain when we start to think holistically instead of just playing recurrent programs that play over and over again and activate the same pathways. So the relevance is that once we start to engage in whole brain activity, we enhance our ability as humans on this planet. And now we're beginning to find out there are many different ways to engage and activate the whole brain. Some of them involve simple exercises such as something called brain gym. And brain gym is a very interesting exercise of the body and the nervous system integration in this way. My right hand is controlled by my left hemisphere. My left hand is controlled by my right hemisphere. But here's an interesting story. If my right hand, controlled by my left hemisphere, crosses the midline, then it simultaneously gets picked up by the other hemisphere because now it's in that territory as well. So when you cross your arms and when you cross your legs, what you're doing is causing the right and the left hemispheres to work together in harmony. When we are activating brain synchronization, where right and left hemispheres are engaged together simultaneously, it activates something like superlearning. With both hemispheres working together, we have much more superior characteristics of neural function. However, after age 7 and 8, we start to express what is called brain dominance, meaning during the day, we don't have synchronization of both hemispheres. During the day, it's like a wave form. Sometimes we're more in the left hemisphere, sometimes we're more in the right, then it comes back to the left and back to the right, so that we're cycling through one hemisphere at a time. This is called brain dominance, where one hemisphere is dominant over the other hemisphere. Well, the relevance about that is integrating our lives is very difficult in brain dominance for a simple reason. As been suggested, our left hemisphere is based on logic and details. Our right hemisphere is actually associated with emotions and wholeness. And this becomes very important because if you're only looking with your left hemisphere, then all the logic things make sense, but there's no emotional component to it. And reverse, if you're in the right hemisphere, you get emotionally tied up, but the logic drops out. Well, this happens to us ever since the time we were 8 through our adult life. If you can get both hemispheres to be in sync, hemisync, then you're engaging logic and emotions at the same time. That opens up a window for super learning opportunities where you can download information very, very quickly and very fast, but it also opens up a whole wide range of thinking that includes an emotional component as well as an intellectual component, which is necessary to fulfill a whole picture. So if you're operating from brain dominance, you're actually shutting off one component of your nervous system at that time. So if you do an exercise like brain gym where you're involved with crossing your arms and your legs, when you do that, you start to integrate both. Very interestingly, when we have hemisync, we're much more calm, collected, and able to really express neurological functions that are very fully supporting of ourselves. And this is why it's very interesting when you go home and relax at night, sometimes you find yourself with your ankles crossed over each other just sitting in your chair. Without even knowing what you're doing, by crossing your ankles, you're actually engaging a whole brain process. So if you're stressed, for example, during the day, or you just want to relax when you go home at night, crossing your arms and legs actually engages both hemispheres, which calms the system down, but engages a whole brain process. So you become much more effective in your relaxed state. So if you're having a tough moment during the day, just take a moment and cross your arms and legs. Hold them together and just wait for about 3 or 4 minutes and you'll start to feel a calmness overcome. And in this calmness, your neurological functions will be totally enhanced. When we start to operate from patterns that are replayed every day, we start to express very specific pathways that are reused over and over and over again. And as a result, we actually shut down a large amount of functioning of the brain and just go through the habit, the patterns that replay themselves over and over again. So basically, what you really have to understand is this: we can use 100% of the brain, but if we play the same patterns over and over again, we don't need to use 100% of the brain. So, simple point, I'd just like to suggest that once you start to recognize that you can have hemisync, where you can get right and left hemispheres to engage together and stay conscious, you are using 100% of your brain activity. And when you do that, you'll also find that your life is easier, more harmonious, and healthier. Because when you're using your full nervous system, it will support your life and enhance your growth. And this becomes important. So don't get stuck that I'm only using 10% of my brain. That story is false. You can use 100%, and it's available to us. And basically all you have to understand is this: stay conscious, stay mindful, and stop playing the same patterns over and over again, because that opens up an opportunity to create new behavior when you stop playing the programs.
Doamna doctor, înțeleg că putem să ne reprogramăm și să ne creștem cu mult peste 10% capacitatea de procesare a creierului.
Și mai ales să dezvoltăm emisfera dreaptă. Pentru că ați văzut, domnul doctor a spus că este esențial să începem să lucrăm, să dezvoltăm emisfera dreaptă. Lucru pe care nu-l facem, societatea nu ne ajută să dezvoltăm emisfera dreaptă. Pe de altă parte, nu este vorba doar despre minte. Știți, pentru că noi oamenii față de animale avem și conștiință. Noi cu asta ne deosebim, cu o conștiință ridicată, o minte ascuțită, suntem mult mai inteligenți decât animalele, da? Nu există comparație, dar și avem și conștiință. Și iar conștiința, o să vedem, este un instrument deosebit, special în modelarea, în armonizarea minții noastre, personalității noastre, pentru că expresia minții este personalitatea, și expandarea inteligenței umane. Acum o să vedem un film despre conștiință.
It is the most fundamental experience of all, defining our waking moments and giving rise to all that we think and feel. Without consciousness, we have no way of proving we or anything else exists. And yet, what it is and why we have it remain a mystery that some of the greatest minds have been unable to solve.
The only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. I wake up in the dark of a hotel room, I'm discombobulated because I'm jet-lagged, I have no idea where I am, or even who I am, or in what country I am, yet I know I exist because I see something.
Rapid advances in our understanding of how the brain works might one day allow us to pinpoint the parts of the brain that generate consciousness. But will something as objective as science be able to explain what it feels like to be us?
Consciousness by its nature is private. It's subjective. I know about my consciousness from the first person point of view. Other people can only know about my consciousness very indirectly.
Philosophers have been trying to answer some of these questions for millennia. In the past couple of centuries, scientists have joined them. Debate can be fierce. In fact, some scholars reckon the puzzle of consciousness is something the human mind is incapable of solving.
I think that's not just wrong, I think it's culpably wrong. It isn't impossible at all, it's just that we have to buckle down and do it.
One thing that both disciplines can agree on is that consciousness arises in the brain. Made up of roughly 85 billion neurons and other supporting cells about which we know little, the brain consumes almost 20% of our energy, despite comprising just 2% of our mass.
Every so often I get kind of interested in astronomy and cosmology because you look out there and you think, oh gosh, this is amazing, it's almost limitless. But then I turn around and I kind of introspectively think about the brain, and it's kind of like a universe within. We're a long ways of understanding how it works, but if we could get down to figuring out how a neuron works, by God, then we could do it at 2 neurons, and then 4 neurons, and then 4 million neurons, and then 100 million.
Helped by developments in imaging, partly pioneered by Dr. Reichel and his team, scientists can study in some detail the 2 enormous folded sheets of outer brain called the cerebral cortex. This plays a crucial role in higher brain functions like memory, perception, thought, and language.
And I have 2 of them in my left and right. And it's part of this sheet that gives rise to consciousness. This sheet also gives rise to intelligence and reasoning and all the other things that we hold dear about the human brain and the human mind.
Christoph Koch wants to come up with a satisfactory scientific theory of consciousness before he dies.
Science wants to explain everything. If science fails to explain the central fact of my existence, I would say then it's a failure.
In order to gain a better understanding of how parts of the brain work, scientists often look at bits of it that are broken.
There is a little part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is at the back of my brain. If I lose it, I will be unable to, let's say, to dance or be a rock climber, and I have difficulty moving. My speech becomes slurred, but my consciousness will not be impaired.
On the flip side, it seems that some parts of the brain may be essential for consciousness. Identifying these so-called neural correlates of consciousness would help pin down what is happening.
What might the NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness, be like? Assuming that it's an emergent neuroscientific process. And let me say straight away that we don't know what it's like.
Before his death in 2004, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, worked with Dr. Koch on something they termed the binding problem. Put simply, the binding problem asks how the brain integrates different bits of information it gets, both sensory and internal, into our conscious experience.
In real life, the brain is terribly good and puts everything together, the movement, the shape, and the color. The usual way of saying the binding problem is if you have a red square and a green triangle. How is it that you don't see it as get the colors mixed up with the shapes? That's basically the problem.
Because our experience of consciousness is derived from the data we get from lots of different systems, the visual and motor being just two, the two men looked at a part of the brain that is connected to all these regions. They were especially interested in the claustrum, a thin sheet of nerve cells that sits at the bottom of the cerebral cortex in each hemisphere of the brain. Because testing the claustrum in a live human brain is invasive and risky, no formal experiments have been done. But one happened accidentally last year when a neurologist trying to understand the source of his patient's epilepsy implanted electrodes near her claustra. When he switched the current on, she lost consciousness. As soon as he switched it off, she regained it.
No one knows why we have consciousness. It's one of the big mysteries. Why did evolution bother putting consciousness in? How did evolution put consciousness in? Why couldn't we have done everything that we do with a set of objective mechanisms and no first-person subjective experience of the world? It's one of the biggest questions in philosophy and science.
Just as the processes of consciousness remain a mystery, so does its purpose. Is it a high-level summary the brain generates to help us plan for what comes next? A clever way of designing our brains to make us more adept at being social? Neither? Both? One evolutionary explanation for why we have consciousness suggests that an animal capable of modeling the behavior of another can anticipate it to its advantage.
The surprising thing is that so few animals actually have this ability. Humans have it. So I have a very good idea of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and why you're going to do it. And children starting at maybe around 3 years old get that.
Janet Metcalf studies something called the theory of mind.
Theory of mind is actually a misnomer. The way we test it is whether a person or an animal can give evidence that they can get into the other person's shoes or the other person's mind and see the world from that person's perspective. Now, the test of it is often not just can you see from the viewpoint of the other person, but could you see that someone has a different viewpoint from your own?
The theory of mind might provide one way of working out if animals other than humans are conscious.
The only species that we're absolutely sure has theory of mind is human. And maybe humans older than roughly 3 years old. It's very controversial whether any other animals have it. They're arguing about whether chimps have theory of mind or not.
Before we can have a theory of mind, we must recognize ourselves. For decades, scientists have used something called the Rouge test to see whether animals do just that. Human babies do from about 18 months old. Chimpanzees, presented with mirrors, soon use them to groom themselves, much as we do. Elephants, dolphins, and magpies also can respond to mirrors in ways that suggest self-recognition.
The problem with the Rouge test that the animal researchers always raise is that maybe it's just body knowledge, that it's not mind knowledge. So it was interpreted as the animal knowing that they have a mind, and theory of mind as we normally think about it is related to another person, not to the self. But presumably you have to know that you have a mind before you project that same capability onto someone else.
Identifying the neural correlates of self-recognition in animals would be a hard task. But if we were able to do it, comparative studies would be possible. That would be hugely valuable. Science is edging closer to understanding what parts of the brain might be involved in generating conscious experience. By some estimates, we may not be far away from an empirically sound theory of consciousness and how it evolved. But could a physical theory ever satisfactorily address what it is that people are feeling when they are conscious? David Chalmers calls consciousness the hard problem, a deft description for something that is hard to explain and hard to solve.
The methods of science right now are great for explaining objective processes and objective functions. So when it comes even to explaining things like the behavior of an organism, you can tell some story about a bit of the brain, a neural process or a computer-like process in the brain that makes us behave a certain way. But the problem of consciousness, what we call the hard problem of consciousness, which is explaining how you get subjective experience from the brain, is not that kind of question. It's not a question about how we behave. It's a question about what it's like, about how it feels from the inside. And it looks like you can explain all those objective mechanisms and objective processes, and you still won't have answered the hard problem, which is why is it that all that functioning is accompanied by consciousness?
The hard problem divides philosophers and scientists alike. Some philosophers argue that consciousness can be explained far more simply.
A lot of puzzles, no mysteries. We're going to understand it from the bottom up and from the top down. I have no doubt about that.
Daniel Dennett argues that consciousness is nothing more than a cognitive illusion that science will, in due course, explain.
Our brains have been designed by evolution and then redesigned by cultural evolution to give us a user-friendly system of things in the world that we deal with. So the user-friendly world that we live in, the manifest image, is a sort of friendly user illusion in the same way that the desktop of your laptop is a user illusion. It simplifies and it distorts in helpful ways for most purposes. If you really want to know what's going on, you have to go backstage. And the same thing is true about the brain and consciousness. Until recently, we didn't have very good tools for doing it. The brain was just off limits as distant galaxies. We're now developing the tools for non-invasively studying the brain, and we're now developing the computational ideas and models so that we can understand how a brain can non-miraculously deal with information and refine it and uncover the semantics of the world outside and inside. So we now have the toolkit, and it's taken this long to develop it. Now we just have to use the tools.
Perhaps. But for the time being, the puzzle of consciousness continues to pose more questions than it does answers. Yet another philosopher, Protagoras of Abdera, proclaimed that man is the measure of all things. Until the problem of consciousness is solved, though, that might better be phrased, the measure of all things but himself.
Există zone din creier care au legătură cu conștiința?
Se pare că da, așa arată, ați văzut? Și aș vrea să arăt aici câteva astfel de poze, da? Niște imagini o să arătăm despre această zonă numită claustrum, pentru că am văzut că există o zonă în creier legată de conștiință. Ia uitați, în Wikipedia, claustrum este ca un strat subțire de substanță cenușie, cu traiect ondulat, o să vedem, și de asemenea o să vedem câteva imagini pe care le-am ales special despre acest claustrum. Uitați, așa arată. Deci este situat în zona centrală, destul de centrală în creier. E așa ca o barieră subțire, ca o virguliță, o să vedem. Și imediat o să vedem mai multe imagini. Ia uitați, exact, ca o virguliță, observați. De asemenea, aici este bucățica aceasta mov, foarte subțire. Da, ați observat cât de importantă este acest aspect de virgulă, iar aici este zona unde s-a pur și simplu s-a pus electrodul când s-a stimulat creierul. Și uitați, aici ne ajută tehnica și derulează toate imaginile cu zona conștiinței, se numește. Este zona care ne face să avem acces. Aici este o poză scanată în creier. Și aceasta este din nou zona respectivă. Bun, toate aceste imagini nu au fost, deci noi în Facultatea de Medicină nu am vorbit foarte mult, e o descoperire recentă și ne ajută foarte mult să înțelegem cam cum ar arăta lucrurile, adică să putem să înțelegem mai multe despre noi înșine. Acum este o zonă din neocortex care este legată de conștiința de sine, deci. Adică, ce înseamnă conștiința de sine? Înseamnă de a recunoaște că noi suntem conștienți de noi, adică de sinele nostru. Care noi? Sinele nostru. Adică ce înseamnă sinele nostru? Sinele nostru înseamnă așa, că de fapt el nu e al nostru. Știți? E în noi, e temporar în noi acest sine, se numește sufletul, adică de fapt. Și el e divin. Deci noi, ca să putem să fim conștienți de prezența divină din noi, trebuie să începem să știm că ceva e în noi, la acest sine superior. Și această zonă are legătură, se pare, cu această cunoaștere de sine. Puterea minții și puterea conștiinței sunt modalitatea, de fapt, prin care noi funcționăm. Noi materializăm prin minte. Deci cu cât suntem mai concentrați, cu atât materializăm mai mult. Dar și modalitatea prin care existăm pe planetă, ca și grup, și anume ca specie umană. În cazul conștiinței, dimensiunile sunt incomensurabile, pentru că vorbim de o conștiință globală. Deci conștiința asta undeva, la nivel planetar, arată ca o conștiință globală, noi fiind o unitate. În 1995, două generatoare aleatorii de numere, aflate la 20 de kilometri distanță, au indicat o modificare măsurabilă exact în timpul decernării premiilor Oscar la televizor, în care jumătate din planetă se uita la premiile Oscar. Știți că e un eveniment foarte mediatizat. Deci o concentrare colectivă, masivă, poate genera forțe măsurabile fizic-electric. Deci noi, puterea conștiinței noastre, da, pentru că acolo era un lucru deosebit, se lucra decenarea premiilor Oscar, stimula emisfera dreaptă. Era vorba de un eveniment artistic. Era vorba de emisfera dreaptă. Deci noi suntem foarte puternici, de fapt. Dar suntem puternici la un loc? Vedeți? Știți, divide et impera, adică divide și stăpânește. Și saltul în conștiință, deci, care va produce marele pas în umanitate, este să realizăm că nu putem decât împreună. Deci noi suntem într-adevăr o forță măsurabilă, dar numai toți la un loc. Dacă noi suntem bucățele mici, nu contăm. Nu avem o putere, fiecare dintre noi, avem o putere colectivă. Deci, practic, suntem o forță decât împreună. Și așa am fost creați. Noi am fost creați că numai prin iubire să reușim, pentru că în momentul în care suntem împreună, noi deci avem o relație bună, deci ne iubim, știți? Acum, deoarece conștiința noastră nu este foarte dezvoltată, pentru că știți că sunt foarte puțini, noi avem puține emisiuni spirituale, noi avem o misiune de medicină și spiritualitate aici. Pentru că așa considerăm, așa apreciem, vedeți dumneavoastră, noi facem media, dacă facem, cum dăm o notă, e vorba de conștiința globală, degeaba unii au un nivel spiritual ridicat. Da? De exemplu, cei care se uită la misiunile noastre, trebuie să știți că sunt persoane care sunt interesate odată pentru partea medicală, dar sunt și persoane care au un nivel spiritual. Că de asta se uită, că asta dezvoltă în aceste emisiuni. Da? Acum, fără ceilalți nu putem face nimic, pentru că depindem unii de alții. Înțelegeți ce vreau să vă spun? Deci chiar dacă suntem unii dezvoltați, nu contează. Adică trebuie să ne dezvoltăm toți. Inteligența pe care o exersăm în școli, știți, școlile, în societatea noastră, inteligența se dezvoltă foarte mult, dar și spiritualitatea pe care societatea nu o promovează. Da, sunt rare emisiunile de genul acesta, sunt singurele, de fapt, instrumente cu care noi putem accesa ca specie, putem să ne ridicăm, putem să evoluăm. De aceea cuvântul cheie este unitate, armonie, iubire.